Chapter 17 of Ester Ried's Namesake. This recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried's Namesake by Pansy. Chapter 17. Discipline. Esther grew very pale as she stood looking at her caller. If she trusted him at all, she could not misunderstand him. And she could not but feel that her decision involved more, much more, than a Sunday evening concert, and that the test of her sincerity had come soon and with force. But there was no hesitation in her thoughts. She had never seen what she believed to be her duty more plainly. Her manner was very gentle as she replied. She felt that he had been compelled by circumstances to say more to her than at that time he had meant to do, and she was willing to let him see that she suffered with him in his disappointment. "I cannot do that, Mr. Langham, because I do not think that for me it would be right; and however narrow my sense of right may be, I am sure that you would not ask me to violate it." He was deeply hurt; it showed in his eyes. He could not enter into her world just then, even for a moment, and realize that this which seemed so trivial to him was really a matter of conscience to her. What he felt was that, although he had spoken so plainly, she was not willing to put aside a prejudice for his sake. He had no further word that he was willing to speak. Even at that moment a warning whistle in the near distance told them both that there was barely 10 minutes left for those who would make the 7:10 train. So with no other farewell than a grave bow, Mr. Langham turned and walked rapidly away. Esther stood for several seconds where he had left her. Then she went out to the quiet corner of the porch. What had she done? Had he meant— what else could he have meant but that which his eyes and voice told her? And she had sent him away grieved, hurt, offended, probably, beyond all recall. "No," said her heart, "not if he really cares for me. So small a matter would not be allowed to come between us. If I thought he would cast aside a friend merely because she could not accept an evening's invitation, he would probably not be worthy of another thought. If it can be possible that I understood him, he will come back, and surely he meant me to understand. I can make it plain to him what I think, what I mean, and together we—" She broke off to laugh a low, happy laugh. How swiftly she was moving in thought! She heard the train whistle shriek and pause for a moment, then with another warning shriek rush away. She wondered if he were on it, and if he would find some one in town upon whom to bestow that other ticket. There had not been time to fill her place from the multitudes of college girls who would have been more than willing to go. Was she glad of that? Faith would have gone. Could she possibly be glad that Faith had missed it? How horribly selfish she must be growing! Whoever he found would not hear those words that he had wanted to say. They were for her alone, and at thought of them the happy look deepened in her eyes. Then she had a single sigh for herself. She wished that Sunday trains were right. Perhaps they were. Perhaps she was narrow, as so many of her friends thought. Perhaps even though principles, as her father was fond of saying, never changed, circumstances and environment did, so as to make acts that in certain conditions were wrong, right enough under others. Of course that was so. Well then, she wished that this act could have seemed right to her. What a wonderful thing it would have been to have closed this wonderful Sunday under the spell of such music! And in such companionship, her heart added softly. It would have been an uplift for the week. Then she remembered that she had had her uplift. Yes, and she had companionship, even the Lord Christ. The thought throbbed through her frame like some powerful elixir. It was new, very new, this realization that she could have intimate and constant companionship with the Lord. She had never so understood it. The first ecstasy of her new experience passed, but the assurance and the peace remained. At last Esther had learned how to pray. It did not seem to her that she would be likely to forget it. She tried to write out for her mother and father the history of that marked Sunday, but it puzzled her to tell it. What was the experience through which she had passed? Had she just been converted? Why, no, no indeed. Long ago Jesus Christ accepted her as his child. Then this was what? Had she wandered? Not outwardly. Instead, she had been called straight-laced. But she had never been genuinely happy in her religion, nor satisfied because of it. Now she was. Would it last? She believed that it would. She felt as sure of it as Melindy had. But what proof had she for others? It was while she was revolving these thoughts that she came upon a scrap of verse copied into a newspaper that sounded to her like a call to service. Be what thou seemest, live thy creed, hold up to earth the torch divine. Be what thou prayest to be made, let the great Master's step be thine. What wonderful suggestions of possibilities were here! Ester's whole being thrilled with a new ambition. Live thy creed. If she only had. She knew much about creeds. Her own was built on a solid foundation and would have served her well. Be what thou prayest to be made. Oh, if she only could! She was praying a wonderful prayer in these days. She decided that she would not try to write anything about it. There was really nothing that could be told. She was going home, soon, to live it. Could she make them understand, simply by watching her life? That would be a life worth while. Poor father! He had been so disappointed in his daughter. But could she be in any sense of the word what she was praying to be made? There was Aunt Sarah still to be borne with, and there was Joram Pratt, and other trials. What was that last line? Let the great Master's step be thine. Ester laid down her pen. There was a sudden rush of tears. The possibilities of such living as that for a moment overwhelmed her. If that could be, if her steps could, even in a faint degree, be suggestive of her Master! She would try, oh, she would try so hard! And with infinite strength to lean upon, it might be that; and besides, she was going home very soon; that, of itself, would help her. Never could there have been a girl more eager for home. Long before this she had calculated to the fraction of a day, now she knew literally the number of hours that intervened. Then suddenly, as though swooping down upon her from some outside source, came a horrible question. Why don't you stay where you are? You have some reason to think that Mrs. Victor would be glad of your help, and would even pay you something for extra work; and in this way you could not only save traveling expenses, but really be earning a little toward next year. When this suggestion was first made to the homesick girl, as a mere possibility, her strongest feeling was indignation. Then, as it gradually came upon her that perhaps it was her duty to consider it, she grew faint and sick over the possible result. Very soon after this, Mrs. Victor added her drop of misery by pointing out the wisdom of such a course and the folly of any other; then, of her own will, proposed a money equivalent for extra time, which Ester knew would aid considerably in the replenishing of her wardrobe. For an entire day this problem was carried about, through all the details of college and kitchen work, and by night Ester had reached the conclusion that at least she ought to tell father and mother about it. Of course she would be governed by their decision; but she would be strictly honest, and own that she was fearfully homesick, and hated the very thought of staying. Deep in her heart was a comfortable little feeling that mother would not consent to any such plan, and that by the first mail possible she would be peremptorily ordered home. And then, before she had had time to get all the comfort out of this probability, the whole matter assumed a different aspect. Katherine Victor fell ill. From the first she was seriously ill, and as the days passed and the disease developed into typhoid fever, she grew desperately so. During commencement week she was tossing in delirium, and Ester who, long before that, had spent many hours in retrimming and otherwise freshening her good white dress for class day, did not leave the house during the entire day. It had been found impossible to secure extra help, and common decency demanded that she should not desert the family in their sore need. By the following evening both Blanche and Faith were gone, as were most of her acquaintances, and Ester, who had herself expected to take that evening's train for home, stood by the kitchen window watching the smoke roll up from its departing engine. Crushed in her hand was a very short letter from her father, which she did not need to read again; she knew its contents by heart. It was later by only a day than that one from her mother which, as she had expected, directed her to come home. Her father's read: "I am catching the next mail to reply to your letter which came but an hour ago. There is time for only a word. God bless you, dear Ester Ried, you are your mother's own girl, faithful and fearless, and true as steel. Of course you know what it is to us, your mother and me, to give up your home coming. Rather, you don't know, and we are glad that you cannot appreciate it in all its fullness. For of course we understand that you, being the child of your mother, cannot do otherwise than stay. Your mother will write to-morrow, dear, and say all the things that father cannot. But he will talk much about you to the Father in heaven." Now she would have to stay, of course. She had known it all the while. It was just like her father and mother. Deep down in her heart the girl knew that it was also like herself. She could not have deserted the Victors in their need. "If I could," she had told herself sturdily, "it would have proved that I am not my father's and mother's daughter." Nevertheless, it was hard. That swift moving train, which was even now rounding the curve and in another moment would be out of sight and sound, seemed to be carrying her heart away. Was it harder for her because the train was also carrying away Mr. Langham? Yes, certainly it was. Why should she deny this to her secret self? Had she not a right to miss her friend? She had not seen him except in class since that Sunday evening, now more than 2 weeks away. In the classroom he had been, of course, as usual. Courteous in manner, careful in explanation, close and unsparing in criticism, critical in his demands for their best efforts. Yet Ester could feel in his manner a change not discernible to others. When she came with a question, he made no effort to detain her for an additional word. And not once during the entire time had he happened to be in the doorway just starting down the avenue as she passed out with her books. It was not that he seemed to be offended. Nothing could be kinder than his manner, and he was on the watch to do for her all that a teacher could. But he managed to convey to her the belief that he was deeply hurt. Just how this idea was conveyed Ester could not have told, but she felt it, and it troubled and disappointed her. If he had understood her position, surely he could not have been hurt. Was it her duty to try to make him understand that she had not been governed by a mere whim, but by a settled conviction of duty, in declining the courtesy he had made such an effort to extend to her? This question she had considered much during those closing days of the college year, but because she did not see quite how to set about it she hesitated, and he had finally gone without another word of good-bye than that spoken in class and shared by all. The summer was long and hard. Katherine Victor lay for weeks very ill indeed. There were days together when no one but the mother had a shred of hope. When at last the disease spent itself and immediate danger was over, and then when the long, slow convalescence began, life in the kitchen at least did not grow less strenuous. In some respects it was even harder than when the dignity of a swift coming sorrow was upon them, thrusting all other troubles into the background of insignificance. Esther Randall, who had stood at her post during all the strain and stress of the anxious days, had still the endless round of menial and petty duties to look after that serious illness thrusts upon some one, and in addition to that must bear the strain that comes upon overwrought nerves when an awful weight of anxiety has finally lifted. Not Mrs. Victor alone, but Marion, and even the young daughter Selma, helped in this way to discipline the girl who, before this summer's experience, had been always too ready to yield to the demand of "nerves." Amid all the trials and perplexities of that hard summer one golden thread of comfort had held steadily. She was not the Esther with whom the season had begun. There was a radical difference. Never mind if only she and the Master knew of this; they knew and were glad. He had been present with her through all the days. It was he who had arrested the quick word, the impatient gesture, even the flash of the expressive gray eyes when they wanted to flash anger or indignation. It had not been easy. On the contrary, it had been hard. Sometimes there had been inward turmoil when there was outward calm; but Esther Randall was able to tell herself with an exultant thrill that during these weeks of peculiar and steady trial she had not outwardly disgraced her Lord. His grace had been sufficient. Of course it had. He had said it would be. He had said it long ago, but Ester had never before been able to appropriate it. CHAPTER 18. Recording by Trisha G.